had spent 40 years walking through the same factory gates before sunrise. Rain or snow, holidays or weekends, I was always there. People often asked why I never left for a better-paying company. I would smile and say, some places become part of your family. The truth was more complicated than that. The factory had watched me grow from a nervous 27-year-old maintenance technician into the oldest employee still, wearing a blue work jacket every morning. Machines had changed. Buildings had expanded. CEOs had come and gone. But I stayed, not because I lacked ambition, because every important decision I made had another name attached to it. My son, Ryan. One Monday afternoon, I received an envelope with the company logo embossed in gold. At first, I assumed it was another benefits notice or retirement paperwork. Instead, I found an elegant invitation. Please join us in celebrating Daniel Carter's 40 years of dedicated service at the annual Leadership Recognition Ceremony. I read the sentence 3 times before it truly sank in. 40 years, someone had actually remembered. I gently folded the invitation and placed it on the kitchen table, staring at it while sunlight filtered through the curtains. I wasn't a man who expected applause. Most of my career had been spent behind walls, under conveyor belts, repairing things before anyone even noticed they were broken. Recognition had never been the reason I came to work. Still, it felt nice. That evening I took out the only navy suit I owned. It had been hanging untouched since my wife's funeral 6 years earlier. I brushed away the dust and smiled quietly. Looks like you'll have one more day of service. I whispered around 7 o'clock. Ryan arrived. He walked into the kitchen carrying his laptop bag, dressed in an expensive tailored suit that probably cost more than my monthly pension. Would someday be? Hey, Dad. Perfect timing, I said with a smile. Look what came today. I handed him the invitation. His smile disappeared almost immediately. He read it silently before placing it back on the table. Oh, I waited for congratulations instead. He sighed, Dad, can we talk? Something in his voice made my stomach tighten. Of course. Ryan rubbed the back of his neck. The ceremony is kind of a big corporate event. I figured there will be executives from New York, investors, clients, the media. Sounds important. It is. He hesitated for several seconds before speaking again. I actually think maybe you shouldn't go. The room became strangely quiet. I wasn't sure I had heard him correctly. I'm sorry. Ryan avoided my eyes. I just mean, everyone there knows me now. My career's really taking off. They're expecting, well, he searched for kinder words. You know, someone a little more. He never finished the sentence. He didn't have to. UNDERSTOODA maintenance worker. An old man with rough hands, a father whose work boots never matched the polished shoes of corporate executives. You think I'd embarrass you? I said softly. Ryan looked relieved that I had said it first. It's not like that. It sounds exactly like that. He sat down across from me. Dad, people judge. They always do. I just don't want unnecessary questions. I nodded slowly, for the first time in years. The invitation lying on the table no longer felt special. It felt heavy. Ryan continued speaking, trying to explain that he was only protecting his professional image, that nobody would notice if I missed one ceremony. But I had already stopped listening. I simply looked at my hands. The same hands that had repaired machines through countless nights, the same hands that had packed his school lunches, the same hands that had held the bicycle seat until he learned to ride without falling. Finally, I smiled, a small, tired smile. It's okay, son. You understand? I understand. Relief washed across his face. Thanks, Dad. After he left, the house became silent again. I walked to my bedroom, carefully, hung the navy suit back inside the closet, folded the invitation, placed it inside a drawer. Then I turned off the light. Maybe Some people simply weren't meant to be guests of honor. Asterisk.
The next morning, I woke up before sunrise out of habit. For 40 years, my body had learned to greet the day before the alarm ever rang. I brewed a pot of coffee, fed the birds that visited my backyard every morning, and sat quietly on the porch with the invitation still tucked inside the kitchen drawer. At exactly 8 o'clock, my phone buzzed with a reminder about the ceremony. I looked at the notification for several seconds before turning the screen off. Ryan had asked me not to come. I had promised I understood. So I stayed home. Across town, the Grand Riverside Hotel buzzed with excitement. The ballroom had been transformed overnight into a polished celebration of the company's history. Large banners displayed photographs from different decades. Tables were decorated with white flowers and navy ribbons bearing the company logo. Executives greeted investors, dock department. Managers shook hands with former employees. Journalists adjusted their cameras near the stage. Everyone expected another elegant corporate event. Ryan walked confidently through the room in a tailored charcoal suit, smiling as colleagues congratulated him on his recent promotion. "Your father's retiring today, right?" one manager asked. Ryan forced a smile. "Yeah, something like that." He quickly changed the subject. Deep down, he believed the difficult conversation with his father was behind him. Daniel would stay home, the ceremony would pass smoothly, and no awkward questions would be asked. At least, that was the plan. At 10 o'clock sharp, the lights dimmed, a soft piano melody filled the ballroom. Margaret Lewis, the company's CEO, stepped onto the stage to warm applause. She was known throughout the industry as a calm, thoughtful leader who rarely wasted words. She smiled at the audience before looking down at her notes. Then she looked up again. Her eyes slowly scanned the ballroom. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. Her expression changed. Instead of beginning her prepared speech, she leaned toward the microphone. "Before we continue," the room fell silent. "I'd like someone to help me answer one question." She looked across the hundreds of guests. "Where's Daniel Carter?" The applause instantly disappeared. People exchanged confused glances. Several department heads turned toward one another. Ryan's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected anyone to notice. Margaret looked toward the reserved front table. One chair remained empty. The nameplate still read Daniel Carter. Frowned. "I was informed Mr. Carter accepted our invitation." "No." When answered, Ryan felt dozens of eyes drifting toward him. His palms began to sweat. Margaret spoke again, this time more firmly. "Does anyone know why our guest of honor isn't here?" A vice president quietly whispered to another executive. "I thought he was already in the building." "So did I." Ryan slowly stood. I think my father decided not to come." Margaret looked directly at him. "Decided?" "Yes." "Did he tell you why?" Ryan hesitated. I'm not really sure. It wasn't exactly a lie. He knew. Why? He simply couldn't bring himself to say it aloud. Margaret remained silent for several seconds. Then she closed the folder containing her prepared speech. "I'm afraid we cannot continue." A ripple of surprise spread through the ballroom. The master of ceremonies looked confused. One of the event coordinators hurried onto the stage. Margaret quietly said something to her before turning back toward the audience. "For 40 years, Daniel Carter has never failed to show up when this company needed him." She paused. "If today is the first day he's missing," her voice softened, "then something must be very wrong." The room became completely still. Ryan lowered his head. For the first time that morning, a painful thought crossed his mind. What if his father hadn't simply stayed home? What if he had been hurt? What if something had happened on the way? Margaret stepped away from the podium and addressed the event. "Staff, I want someone to contact Mr. Carter." Immediately, another employee quickly reached for a phone. No answer. Someone else tried. Straight to voicemail. The atmosphere shifted from celebration to concern. Guests who had arrived expecting awards and speeches were now whispering nervously. Ryan felt his stomach tighten. He pulled out his own phone. No missed calls. No new messages. He stared at his father's contact photo for a long moment before pressing the call button. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. No answer. Ryan swallowed hard for the first time since telling his father not to attend. Guilt began pushing through the confidence he had carried into the ballroom. Margaret returned to the microphone. "I've worked with Daniel Carter for over 20 years. She looked around the room. "Most of you know him as a maintenance director." She smiled sadly. "But almost none of you know what he truly did for this company." She gently placed her prepared speech aside. "Believe it's time you did." Ballroom fell into complete silence. No one reached for their coffee. No one checked their phones. Every eye turned toward the stage. Ryan slowly lowered himself into his chair, for reasons he couldn't explain. He suddenly felt afraid of what he was about to hear.
The applause slowly faded. For the first time that afternoon, the ballroom was completely quiet. Margaret Lewis smiled warmly as she stepped away from the microphone. "Daniel," she said, I believe everyone here would love to hear a few final words. Daniel looked around the room, then down at the leather-bound legacy book resting in his hands. He let out a small nervous laugh. I've spent 40 years fixing machines. He glanced toward the audience. Nobody ever trained me to make speeches. The room responded with gentle laughter. Daniel took a slow breath and walked to the center of the stage. He stood silently for several moments, not because he didn't know what to say, because he wanted to make sure he said the right thing. Finally, he looked toward Ryan. Instead of facing the audience, he walked across the stage and stopped directly in front of his son. He placed one weathered hand gently on Ryan's shoulder. Then he spoke. Everything I've ever done, he smiled softly, was for my family. Ryan lowered his eyes as fresh tears filled them. Daniel continued, when I was young, I believed success meant earning promotions. I believed it meant making more money, owning a bigger house, driving a nicer car.
He chuckled.
Then your mother came into my life. His smile grew warmer. And later, you came along. He looked at Ryan. Everything changed. I was offered opportunities that many people dream about. I was grateful for every single one, but every opportunity came with a question. He paused. What would it cost my family? The audience remained perfectly still. I realized something. There are things money can replace. There are things titles can replace. But there are moments. He smiled sadly. That never come back. He looked around the ballroom. I could always earn another paycheck. I could never attend Ryan's first baseball game twice. I could never watch him graduate a second time. I could never sit beside my wife during chemotherapy after she was gone. His voice trembled slightly. So whenever life asked me to choose, I chose the people waiting for me at home. Ryan could no longer hold back his emotions. Dad, his voice broke. I'm so ashamed. Daniel gently shook his head. No, you've learned, and that's enough. Ryan wiped away his tears. I judged you. I thought you weren't ambitious. I thought you had settled. Daniel smiled. I did settle. The audience looked confused. I settled. He glanced toward Ryan. For the life I wanted. A warm ripple of laughter and applause spread through the ballroom. Daniel continued. I've met people with enormous salaries. I've met people with impressive titles. I've met people who owned beautiful homes. Then he looked around the room. But at the end of the day, the happiest people I've ever known were the ones whose families couldn't wait for them to come home. Daniel turned toward the audience. I've received more recognition today than I ever imagined. He held up the legacy book. I'll treasure this for the rest of my life. But the greatest reward I received, he placed a hand over his heart, is standing beside my son today. Ryan stepped forward. Without saying a word, he embraced his father once more. This time, the applause wasn't prompted by a speech. It came naturally. Hundreds of people stood again, many openly crying. Even seasoned executives who had spent decades hiding emotion wiped tears from their faces. David Moore smiled through wet eyes. That's Daniel. He always knows what's truly important. Margaret returned to the microphone one final time. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe today we've all been reminded of something. She looked around the ballroom. Companies succeed because of talented people, but communities, she smiled toward Daniel, are built by kind people. Another wave of applause filled the room. Margaret presented Daniel with a simple wooden plaque. Unlike the expensive crystal awards displayed earlier, this one carried only a single inscription. Daniel Carter, thank you for choosing people first. Daniel traced the words with his fingertips. He smiled quietly. I've never received an award that meant this much. Several weeks later, life slowly returned to normal. Daniel enjoyed his retirement. He spent mornings fishing, afternoons volunteering at a local vocational school, teaching young mechanics the same patience he had shared for 40 years. The Daniel Carter Leadership Scholarship welcomed its first recipient. Applications poured in from employees across the company, not asking how to become richer, but asking how to become better leaders. Ryan changed too. He stopped measuring success by promotions alone. He left the office earlier whenever he could. He had dinner with Emma every evening. He called his father every Sunday morning, sometimes just to talk, sometimes to ask for advice, sometimes for no reason at all. One autumn afternoon, Ryan and Daniel sat together on the same park bench overlooking the lake, the same place where Daniel had believed he would spend retirement unnoticed. Ryan smiled. You know, I used to think your greatest achievement was working here for 40 years. Daniel laughed. No. Ryan looked at him. It was raising me. Daniel's eyes glistened. I saw one. Perfect, no parent is. Ryan smiled. But you never stopped choosing me. Daniel placed a hand gently on his son's shoulder. And now, he looked proudly at Ryan. You know how to choose the people who matter. The two men sat together in comfortable silence as the sun slowly disappeared beyond the lake. The years of misunderstanding had finally given way to something stronger. Not admiration, not gratitude, family, because in the end, the greatest legacy a person leaves behind isn't written on a building, engraved on a plaque, or measured by a job title. It's written quietly in the hearts of the people who learned how to love because of them.
The ballroom lights dimmed. On the large screen behind the stage, a single photograph slowly appeared. It showed a much younger Daniel Carter standing outside the factory on his very first day of work. He couldn't have been more than 27. His hair was dark. His smile was uncertain. He wore oversized work boots and held a small metal toolbox that looked almost brand new. A soft murmur spread across the room. Daniel stared at the photograph in disbelief. "I haven't seen that picture in decades," Margaret smiled. "We had to search through our archives to find it." The next photograph appeared, Daniel teaching a young apprentice how to repair an engine, then another, helping co-workers shovel snow outside the loading dock during a blizzard. Another, laughing with employees during a company picnic. Another, quietly repairing equipment while everyone else celebrated a successful product launch. Ryan realized something remarkable. In almost every photograph, his father was standing behind someone else. Never in front, never trying to be noticed, always making sure someone else succeeded. The slideshow ended. The company logo faded onto the screen. Then 6 new words appeared beneath it. The Daniel Carter Leadership Scholarship. Daniel blinked. He looked at Margaret. "I'm sorry. I think I've misunderstood." Margaret smiled warmly. "No, Daniel. You've understood perfectly." She stepped closer to the microphone. "Earlier this year, our board of directors voted unanimously to establish a permanent scholarship in your name." The audience applauded, Margaret continued. "Every year from now on, one employee who demonstrates kindness, humility, integrity, and service to others, not simply high performance, will receive the Daniel Carter Leadership Scholarship." The applause grew louder. "It will include full tuition for professional education, leadership development, and career advancement." Daniel shook his head in disbelief. "You named it after me?" Margaret nodded. "Because we want future generations to understand that leadership is not measured by the size of an office." She smiled. "It's measured by the number of lives you improve." The screen changed again. This time it displayed dozens of names. Former employees, current managers, executives, technicians, supervisors, more than 200 people. Margaret turned toward the audience. Every one of these people submitted a letter explaining how Daniel Carter changed their life. Daniel looked stunned. "You collected all of these?" "For nearly 11 months. David Moore laughed. "Keeping it secret nearly killed me." The room laughed with him. Margaret picked up a thick, leather-bound book resting on the podium. Its cover was embossed with gold lettering. The Daniel Carter Legacy book. She handed it to Daniel. Inside were hundreds of handwritten messages, photographs, letters, memories, stories. Daniel carefully opened the first page. The handwriting belonged to a young technician. "You taught me that making mistakes doesn't make someone a failure. Giving up does." He turned another page. "You stayed with me until midnight so I could learn to repair my first production line." Another. "You attended my father's funeral even though I'd only worked here for 3 months." Another. "You believed in me long before I believed in myself." Daniel stopped turning pages, his vision blurred. I didn't know anyone remembered." David gently smiled. "We never forgot." Margaret waited until the room became quiet again. "There is one final surprise." Daniel laughed softly. "I don't think my heart can handle another one." The audience laughed. Margaret nodded toward the entrance. The ballroom doors opened once more. A group of nearly 30 retired employees slowly walked inside. Some used walking canes. Others leaned on family members. Several had traveled hundreds of miles to be there. One by one, they approached Daniel. No speeches, no ceremony, just handshakes, hugs, quiet words. "Thank you. I never forgot. You changed my life." One elderly man, now in his 80s, embraced Daniel tightly. "You trained me on my first day." Daniel smiled through tears. "I remember." The man laughed. "No, you don't. There were hundreds of us." Daniel shook his head. "I remember every face." The old man smiled. "I knew you would." Ryan stood several feet away, unable to hold back his emotions. He had spent years trying to impress people who barely knew his name. Meanwhile, His father had spent 40 years quietly becoming unforgettable. Emma gently whispered, "Your father is one of the richest men I've ever met." Ryan looked confused. "He never had millions." Emma smiled. "No. He has something much harder to earn." She looked around the ballroom filled with grateful faces. A life that mattered. Ryan nodded slowly. For the first time. He understood exactly what she meant. As the final retired employee returned to his seat, Margaret addressed the audience once more. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've attended hundreds of retirement ceremonies." She smiled. "But today isn't really about retirement." She looked toward Daniel. "It's about legacy." Then she turned toward Ryan. "And sometimes, the greatest legacy isn't built inside a company. It's built inside a family." Ryan lowered his head. He knew those words were meant for him. Daniel looked at his son. Ryan met his father's eyes. No words were necessary. One look said everything. Forgiveness, gratitude, love. The applause slowly filled the ballroom again, but this time, it wasn't celebrating the end of Daniel Carter's career. It was celebrating the beginning of something even greater. Ryan drove more slowly on the way back to the hotel. Neither of them spoke much. They didn't need to. Some conversations happen with words. Others happen in the quiet after the truth has finally been revealed. Daniel sat beside the passenger window, watching familiar streets pass by. "I've never liked being the center of attention," he admitted with a small smile. Ryan chuckled. "I know. I was actually hoping they'd hand me a plaque, shake my hand, and let everyone eat lunch." Ryan laughed for the first time all day. "Sorry, Dad. It doesn't look like that's happening anymore." Daniel sighed playfully. "I was afraid you'd say that." When they arrived at the Grand Riverside Hotel, Daniel hesitated before stepping out of the car. He looked down at his clothes. Simple khaki pants, a light blue button-down shirt, comfortable shoes that had seen better days. "I should have worn the suit." Ryan shook his head. "No, you look exactly like the man they're waiting for." Daniel smiled awkwardly. "I still don't think all this is necessary." Ryan placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "It is. For 40 years, you made everyone else's job easier. Today, let us do something for you." Daniel nodded quietly. Together, they walked toward the entrance. Inside the ballroom, hundreds of guests remained seated. No one had left. The catering staff had delayed lunch. The photographers were still waiting. Even the musicians remained by the stage. Margaret Lewis stood near the entrance, checking her watch every few minutes. Then one of the event coordinators hurried over. "They're here." Margaret looked toward the ballroom doors. "They're ready?" The coordinator smiled. "They're together." Margaret took a deep breath. "Good." She stepped onto the stage once again. "Ladies and gentlemen." The room immediately became silent. "Our guest of honor has arrived." Every head turned toward the entrance. The ballroom doors slowly opened. Daniel stepped inside. He immediately stopped walking. He hadn't expected this. Not a single person remained seated. More than 400 employees, retirees, executives, investors, and guests rose to their feet at the same time. No music played. No one spoke. For several seconds, there was only silence. Then one person began clapping. Another joined. Then another. Within moments, the entire ballroom erupted into applause. Not polite applause. Not corporate applause. The kind that comes from genuine gratitude. Daniel looked completely overwhelmed. He instinctively took a small step backward. Ryan gently touched his arm. "They're applauding you," Daniel whispered. "I've never experienced anything like this. You deserve it." The applause continued. Some employees wiped away tears. Others smiled proudly. Many simply kept clapping. David Moore stood near the front with tears openly running down his face. "So that's what 40 years looks like," he whispered. Margaret walked down from the stage. Instead of asking Daniel to come to her, she walked directly to him. She extended her hand. Daniel shook it awkwardly. Margaret smiled warmly. "Welcome home." Daniel laughed softly. "I've worked here my whole life." "I know. That's exactly why this feels like home." She turned toward the audience. "I'd like everyone to notice something." The applause gradually faded. Margaret looked at Daniel's hands. "These hands have repaired thousands of machines." She gently lifted one of them. "They've also lifted co-workers when they felt defeated. They've trained new employees. They've comforted grieving families. They've solved problems that never appeared in annual reports." She paused. "And that's why leadership isn't always found in the executive offices." Her words drew another round of applause. Ryan stood quietly behind his father, his eyes never leaving him. He had spent years believing respect came from expensive suits, impressive titles, and polished presentations. Now he watched a room full of successful people honoring a man wearing ordinary clothes. For the first time, Ryan understood the difference between authority and influence. One could be given, the other had to be earned. Margaret invited Daniel onto the stage. He approached the microphone with obvious discomfort. "I don't really know what to say." Laughter spread gently across the room. Daniel smiled. "I'm usually the person fixing microphones." More laughter. He relaxed slightly. "I honestly thought today was going to be a normal retirement ceremony." "So did I." The audience laughed again. "I've spent most of my life trying not to attract attention." He looked across the room. "So, seeing all of you standing, it feels a little overwhelming." His eyes stopped on Ryan, then on Emma. Finally, he looked toward the employees he had worked beside for decades. "I didn't come to work every day because I wanted recognition. I came because people were counting on me." He shrugged modestly. "That's all." The simplicity of the sentence filled the room with emotion. Margaret stepped back to the microphone. "Daniel." "There is one more thing." Daniel looked confused. "I thought the plaque was the last surprise." Margaret smiled knowingly. "It isn't." She nodded toward the large screen behind them. The lights dimmed. A new presentation appeared. At the top of the screen were 6 words: "A legacy that will never retire." Daniel frowned slightly. "I don't understand." Margaret smiled. "You will." The audience grew quiet once more. Ryan glanced toward the screen, equally puzzled. None of them knew that the company had spent nearly a year preparing one final surprise, one that even Daniel had never imagined. Daniel Carter sat alone on a weathered, wooden bench overlooking the small lake in Riverside Park. The park was only a few blocks from the company. He had come there hundreds of times over the years, sometimes during lunch breaks, sometimes after difficult days, sometimes simply because it was quiet, enough to hear his own thoughts. This morning, he had arrived shortly after 10. The ceremony would be underway by now. He imagined the ballroom filled with applause, awards being handed, out photographs being taken, executives giving speeches, and somewhere among them, Ryan was probably smiling confidently, building relationships that would help his future. Daniel smiled to himself. "That's enough for me." He had never needed to stand on a stage. If staying away made life easier for his son, then perhaps it was the right decision. He watched a family of ducks glide peacefully across the lake. An elderly couple walked hand in hand along the path. A little boy laughed as he chased bubbles floating through the air. Daniel leaned back against the bench. For the first time in years, he felt tired, not physically, emotionally. Across town, Ryan drove through the city with trembling hands, gripping the steering wheel. His father's phone still went unanswered. He checked every place he could think of: Daniel's house, the grocery store, the small diner where they sometimes had breakfast. Nothing. Emma sat beside him. Where else would he go? Ryan stared ahead. "I don't know." Then suddenly, he remembered. The park. Emma looked at him. "The one near the factory." Ryan nodded. "When Mum was sick, he used to go there whenever things became overwhelming." He pressed harder on the accelerator. Back at the ceremony, Margaret Lewis remained on stage. The audience had made no move to leave, No one complained that the schedule had fallen apart. Instead, conversations quietly began around the room. People shared stories about Daniel. One engineer stood. When my wife went into labor unexpectedly, Daniel finished my entire overnight shift. Another employee smiled. When my father passed away, he drove 6 hours just to attend the funeral. Someone near the back added, "He never wanted anyone to know he paid for my certification." "Classes," another voice followed. "He paid for mine too." Margaret listened without interruption. She realized something extraordinary. Daniel had spent 4 decades changing lives, one person at a time, and almost none of those people had known about each other. Ryan finally pulled into the parking lot. Before the car had completely stopped, he was already opening the door. He ran along the winding path, scanning every bench. Nothing. He reached the small wooden bridge. Still nothing. His breathing grew heavier. What if he had waited too long? What if his father had already gone home? Then he saw him. Daniel sat quietly beneath an old oak tree, holding a paper cup of coffee, watching the lake completely, unaware that an entire ballroom full of people had spent the last hour talking about him. Ryan slowed to a stop. For several seconds, he simply stood there, looking at the man he thought he had always known, only now realizing how little he truly understood him. Daniel noticed footsteps approaching. He turned, his expression brightened. "Ryan?" He smiled warmly. "What are you doing here?" Ryan couldn't answer. The words refused to come. Daniel looked concerned. "Is everything okay?" Ryan nodded once, then shook his head. Finally, tears spilled down his face. "I'm so sorry." Daniel immediately stood. "What happened?" Ryan stepped forward. "No." His voice cracked. "I'm the one who made something happen." He wiped his eyes. "I told you not to come." Daniel's gentle smile returned. "It's all right." "No, it isn't. I embarrassed you." Daniel shook his head. "You didn't embarrass me. I hurt you." Daniel looked out over the lake for a moment before answering. "You were worried about your career." "I understand." Ryan stared at him in disbelief. "You understand?" Daniel nodded. "When I was your age, I worried about what people thought too." Ryan whispered, "How can you forgive me so easily?" Daniel smiled. "Because you're my son." The simplicity of the answer shattered whatever composure Ryan still had. He stepped forward and wrapped his arms around his father. For a brief moment, Daniel seemed surprised. Then he quietly hugged him back. Ryan hadn't embraced his father like this since he was a teenager. "I read your letter." Daniel froze. "My letter?" Ryan nodded against his shoulder. "The one you left with David." Daniel closed his eyes. "So, you know. I know everything." Another long silence settled between them. Not an awkward silence. The kind that only exists between people, finally telling each other the truth without speaking after a few moments. Daniel gently stepped back. "I suppose the ceremony is over." Ryan looked directly into his father's eyes. "No. It never really started." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" Ryan smiled through his tears. "The CEO stopped the entire event. They're waiting for you." Daniel blinked. "For me?" Ryan nodded. "The guest of honor never arrived." Daniel looked almost embarrassed. "Oh, I don't think they need an old maintenance man anymore." Ryan laughed softly for the first time. They've been waiting 40 years. Before Daniel could respond, his phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen. "Margaret Lewis," he answered. "Hello?" Margaret's calm voice came through the speaker. "Daniel, I hope I'm not interrupting." "No," she smiled. "Good, because your family," she paused, "and your company are waiting for you." Daniel looked at Ryan. Ryan simply nodded. This time, there was no hesitation. Daniel smiled. "I'll be there." The ballroom was so still that no one dared to whisper. David carefully placed the sealed envelope on the podium. Its edges had yellowed with age. Across the front, written in Daniel's unmistakable handwriting, were only 6 words. "For Ryan. If he ever needs this." Ryan couldn't take his eyes off it. His heartbeat echoed louder than the silence surrounding him. Margaret gently picked up the envelope. "Daniel gave this to David 15 years ago," she said softly. "He never intended for anyone else to read it." She looked toward Ryan, but he also said, "If my son ever believes I chose work over him, then he deserves to know the truth." Ryan lowered his head. His throat tightened. He whispered almost to himself, I'd like to hear it." Margaret slowly opened the envelope. Inside was a single handwritten letter, folded neatly 3 times. The paper was worn from age, but the ink remained clear. She unfolded it with great care. Then she began to read. "Dear Ryan, if you're reading this, something has gone terribly wrong between us. Maybe you think I wasn't there enough. Maybe you believe I love my job more than I loved you. If that's true, then I failed to show you the one thing I wanted you to understand." Margaret paused. The room remained completely silent. She continued, "Every decision I ever made began with one question. What will be best for my son?" Sometimes the answer meant working another overnight shift. Sometimes it meant saying no to opportunities that would have made my career much bigger. Sometimes it meant pretending I wasn't disappointed, because disappointment is much easier for a father to carry than regret. Ryan slowly covered his mouth. Memories flooded back. His father sitting in the bleachers during baseball games, helping him build a science project late into the night, teaching him how to change a tire before college, driving hours just to watch him give a 10-minute speech at graduation. None of those moments had seemed extraordinary. Now they felt priceless. Margaret continued reading. There were 5 promotions. I accepted none of them. Not because I lacked ambition, because every promotion required moving away. Every move meant another school, another neighborhood, another group of friends, another life you never asked for. Ryan closed his eyes. He remembered complaining as a teenager. "Dad, everyone else's parents have bigger houses. Why don't we?" At the time, Daniel had simply smiled. "We have enough." Ryan had thought that answer came from a lack of ambition. Now he understood. It had come from sacrifice. Margaret's voice grew softer. "When your mother became sick." The company offered me another promotion. It paid almost 3 times my salary. I thanked them. Then I said no, because your mother deserved to spend her final years surrounded by people who loved her. Several people quietly wiped away tears. Emma reached for Ryan's hand. He barely noticed. His eyes never left the letter. Margaret turned to the final page. Her own voice trembled slightly. "Ryan, there may come a day when someone tells you success is measured by titles, money, or influence. Don't believe them. Real success is going home. Knowing the people you love, never had to question whether you chose them first. If one day you become a father, choose your family whenever you can, even if they never realize what it cost. One day, they might. And if they don't, love them anyway, because that's what fathers do. Love, Dad." Margaret slowly lowered the letter. No one applauded. No one moved. The silence itself had become the tribute. Ryan stared at the floor. Tears rolled down his face before he even realized he was crying. "I told him not to come," he whispered. "I told my own father not to come." Emma wrapped an arm around his shoulders. She had never seen her husband look so broken. "I didn't know," she whispered. Ryan shook his head. "No," his voice cracked. "I never wanted to know." Across the ballroom, seasoned executives who had negotiated billion-dollar contracts sat with wet eyes. Some quietly removed their glasses. Others simply stared at Daniel's empty chair. Not because it was empty, because they suddenly understood what it represented. 40 years of quiet love. 40 years. David Moore walked slowly toward the stage, the worn manila envelope clutched carefully in his hands. He wasn't the kind of man who enjoyed speaking in front of crowds. For 35 years, he had worked beside Daniel Carter, solving problems before anyone else even knew they existed. If anyone knew the truth about Daniel's life, it was David. Margaret Lewis stepped aside and handed him the microphone. David smiled nervously. "I've never been good at speeches." A few people chuckled. "I'm much better with machines than microphones." The laughter eased the tension, but only for a moment. David looked toward Daniel's empty chair. "I wish my best friend were here to hear this." He paused. But knowing Daniel, he smiled sadly. He'd probably be hiding in the back of the room anyway. The audience laughed again. That's who he is. David slowly opened the old envelope. Inside were several faded documents. Some had yellowed with age. Others were neatly folded letters. He held up the first sheet. "This is dated April 12th, 1996. He looked toward Ryan. "Do you remember anything about that year?" Ryan shook his head. "I was 8. David nodded. "I thought so." He unfolded the paper. "This is Daniel's first promotion offer." A large screen displayed a scanned copy of the letter. "Senior Regional Operations Manager, double salary. Company car, executive housing, full relocation package." Ryan stared at the numbers. His father had never mentioned any of this. David continued. "The company wanted Daniel to move to Chicago. It was a dream opportunity. He deserved it." Someone in the audience whispered, "So why didn't he take it?" David smiled gently, because that same week, he looked at Ryan again. Ryan had just made his first baseball team. The room fell silent. David continued. "I remember telling Daniel he'd be crazy to turn this down. He looked at me and said something I'll never forget." David reached into the envelope and unfolded a small handwritten note. "I wrote it down that day because I knew I'd never hear words like that again." He adjusted his glasses before reading aloud. "Jobs come and go. Titles come and go. My son will only be 8 once." No one moved. David swallowed. He declined the promotion the next morning. Ryan's breathing slowed. A memory surfaced. His father standing behind the fence at every Little League game, helping him practice pitching after work. Never missing a Saturday morning practice, Ryan had always assumed that was normal. He had never wondered what it had cost. David reached for another document. This one's from 2003. Another promotion. Vice President of Plant Operations. Higher salary. Stock options. Company bonus. Relocation required. Again. David smiled. "This time I thought there was absolutely no way Daniel would refuse. He'd already turned one promotion down. He couldn't possibly do it twice." He laughed softly. "I was wrong." Margaret folded her arms, listening quietly. David continued. "I asked him why. He didn't even hesitate," he said. David glanced toward Ryan. Ryan finally feels like he belongs at school. "I'm not taking him away from his friends." Ryan closed his eyes. He remembered middle school. Changing schools had terrified him. He had no idea that choice had never happened because someone else had quietly given up his own future. The audience sat in stunned silence. David slowly placed the second letter on the podium. But Daniel wasn't finished sacrificing. He lifted another document. "Promotion number 3. Gasps spread through the ballroom. "There were 3. David nodded. "Actually," he smiled. "There were 5. Ryan's eyes widened. 5? His father had turned. Down 5 promotions? Why? How? David held up the next letter. This one offered Daniel a corporate executive position. It would have placed him 1 floor below the CEO. Someone quietly whispered, "My God." David nodded. "That's exactly what I said." He looked down at another handwritten note. When I asked him why he was saying no again, he smiled. "And he told me, Ryan's mother is getting sick. She shouldn't have to go through treatment in a city where she doesn't know anyone." Ryan felt something tighten painfully inside his chest. His mother, the cancer, the endless hospital visits. His father had never once complained, not once. David took a deep breath. The ballroom was so quiet that the faint hum of the air conditioning seemed unusually loud. Margaret Lewis rested both hands on the podium and looked across the audience. "I had prepared a speech celebrating 40 years of loyal service," she began, "but I don't think that's enough anymore." She glanced toward Daniel's empty chair. "Most of you know Daniel Carter as the man who fixed broken machines." A few people nodded. He was always carrying a toolbox. He wore the same blue work jacket. He rarely attended management meetings. He was usually the first person to arrive and the last to leave. Margaret smiled gently. "And that's exactly why almost nobody here understands who Daniel Carter really is." Ryan shifted uneasily in his seat. His father had always described his job in the simplest terms. "I fix things. Nothing more, nothing less." Margaret continued. "When I became CEO 12 years ago, I asked our senior leadership one question." She looked toward the executives seated in the front row. "If I could only keep one employee during a crisis, who would it be?" The audience waited. The answer surprised me. It wasn't a vice president. It wasn't an engineer. It wasn't the finance director. She paused. It was Daniel Carter. A murmur spread through the ballroom. Ryan frowned. That couldn't be right. His father had never managed hundreds of employees. He had never appeared in business magazines. He had never spoken at conferences. Why would experienced executives choose him over everyone else? Margaret answered the question before anyone asked it. Because every department trusted him. She pointed toward the operations managers. When production stopped at 2 a.m, they called Daniel. When a storm flooded the plant, they called Daniel. When a machine failed hours before a major customer inspection, they called Daniel. When nobody else could solve the problem, they called Daniel. She smiled. And somehow, he always came. The large screen behind the stage suddenly lit up. Old photographs appeared one after another. Daniel standing beside a worn conveyor belt. Daniel covered in grease after repairing a broken hydraulic press. Daniel smiling beside younger co-workers who had long since retired. Each photograph represented another chapter of 4 decades that Ryan had never taken the time to ask about. Margaret pointed toward one image. This was taken during the winter blackout of 1998. Snow covered the factory roof. The city lost power for nearly 12 hours. Our backup systems failed. Production should have stopped completely. But Daniel refused to leave. She looked around the room. He worked 31 straight hours. He slept on a folding chair for less than 40 minutes. And because of him, the company fulfilled every customer order. Several long-time employees quietly nodded. One elderly supervisor even wiped away a tear. "I remember that week," he whispered. Ryan stared at the screen. He had been 10 years old. He remembered waiting for his father to come home. He remembered being angry because Daniel had missed his school basketball game. At the time, Ryan thought his father simply cared more about work than family. He had never known the reason. Margaret changed to another photograph. Daniel stood beside 3 young mechanics. They all became plant managers. Another slide. They became regional directors. Another. They became engineers. Another. They became vice presidents. Margaret smiled. Daniel personally trained over 200 employees. She paused, and every single one of them says the same thing. He never made anyone feel small. He never took credit. He never stopped teaching. One of the current plant managers stood unexpectedly. "If I may." Margaret nodded. The man smiled toward the audience. "I was 19 when I started here. I almost quit during my first week. I made a mistake that shut down an entire production line. I thought I was going to be fired." He laughed softly. "Instead, Daniel brought me a cup of coffee. He sat beside me for 2 hours and taught me how not to make the same mistake again. The room smiled. He saved my career before it even began." Another employee stood. He did the same for me. Then another. And me. Soon voices echoed across the ballroom. "He trained me. He helped me. He covered my shift when my wife was in the hospital. He drove me home during a snowstorm. He stayed late so I could attend my daughter's graduation. Ryan looked around in disbelief. One after another, people were standing, not because they had been asked to, but because they wanted to tell a story about his father. For the first time in his life, Ryan realized something painful. His father wasn't respected because of his job title. He was respected because of the life he had lived. Margaret raised one hand, and the room slowly became quiet again.